I want to welcome everybody. This is a Daily Maverick webinar brought to you by the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung dudes. So I want to thank them as well. Thank you very, very much. The panel is called Seeding the Divide. And I have with me, it's my great pleasure to have Wandile Sihlobo with me. This is a man who has been on the front lines of the land reform debate for a long time. He has many, many haters. He has many, many people. Do you have any haters?
Not much, not much. I have more people liking hating.
All right. Well, we'll try and make sure that you leave here with some haters today. We'll do everything we can. As everybody here is probably aware, prior to this whole COVID-19 thing, the only thing South Africans were talking about for the most part was land reform. Now we're more concerned about where to get our cigarettes, where to get our alcohol, and whether or not to wear crop pants. But regardless, what Wandile has done has given us an enormous service by collating a whole bunch of his writing and a whole bunch of his research into a book called Finding Common Ground, Land, Equity, and Agriculture. Wandile, it's an outstanding book, very, very necessary. Thanks for putting it together. Everybody on here, please go out. Yep, there it is. There it is. Please go out and buy it. You can get it on Kindle. You can get it at your local bookstore. You can get it at Uber Eats. So go out there and get it. Anyways, I want to give you a little bit of information about Wandile before we get started. He grew up in the Transkei in Eastern Cape. He was educated at Fort Hare in agricultural science. I think he switched from accounting to agricultural science. Then he went to Stellenbosch, did his master's in agricultural economics. He came of intellectual age during the 2008 financial crisis, which was also a food crisis, a food security crisis, where so many of the issues that sort of rebounded from 2008 can be attributed to the fact that so many people across the world simply didn't have access to the food they did prior to the crisis. There's a whole bunch of literature on the Arab Spring, the revolutions throughout the Arab world that pertain, of course, to food security. He's worked with Grain SA. He is currently with the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa, AGBIZ. And of course, he's like everybody, he's been an advisor to the president. So thanks for that. His book, as I've said, is super important. Wandile was part of the 10-person team that produced the famous presidential advisory panel on land reform and agriculture that was submitted in July of 2019. One of his draft papers that was submitted to the 10-person panel has the following horrible line. After 24 years of land reform, it is not possible to conclude in any definitive way whether land reform has actually benefited our economy or our society. That's a terrifying line. So welcome, Wandile. Let's jump straight into it. Land reform, as I said, is the biggest issue in this country. It really is, COVID-19 notwithstanding. Luckily for our president, it's kind of on the back burner for the so he's actually having a bit of a holiday with this COVID-19 thing. Before we jump into anything else, and we will get into the weeds, I want to ask you a straight question, because this is the question that's terrifying most South Africans now, I think. Are we going to starve to death? What is the reality of the food security situation in this country right now?
Yeah. Now, thanks for having me on, Richard, and thanks to the Daily Maverick team for this opportunity. I think I could answer that question in two ways. On a national level, we're not going to starve to death as a country. We actually at a space where we can sell more food to outside countries. We'll be net exporters of a number of commodities that we produce. And we're having bumper harvest in the grains, in the fruits, and a slight recovery on the wine. So on a national perspective, we are fine. But obviously, we know that there's a lot of millions of South Africans that go home that go to bed hungry every evening. And that has a lot to do with the household food insecurity challenge in South Africa. And the roots of that are more from a macroeconomic perspective, not so much the availability of food, or maybe the food is expensive. It's really the fact that people are out of work and they don't have any incomes. Then it becomes a challenge to get the supplies they need. But I think with the recent interventions that the government has made, those could be able to ease up. If you think of the food parcels, the food vouchers, and I think those would be able to assist to a certain extent.
How about rural areas? Are we sort of in the wake of some bumper crops? How has the harvest been over the course of the past year and a half? Because we're also coming out of a drought. I mean, one imagines if this crisis had hit when we were in the midst of that awful drought, things would be looking a little bit different.
Yeah, I think actually, even though we are coming out of a drought, in South Africa, it has been a better one. Yes, last year we were in a drought, and the number of provinces, particularly in the western side of South Africa, were the hardest hit, but we were still in a position where we actually, in the marketing year for maize that ended in April, which is just about last week, we were able to export roughly around about 1.4 million tons of maize. So we were still having enough food. This year, even if you look at the rural areas, you look across all of the major agricultural hubs, we are in good shape in as far as the production is concerned. But I think the bottom line story, Richard, goes back to the point of saying, how do we make sure that people have some bit of income or money to be able to buy what they can grow? And that's where the challenge is about. But affordability and availability and safety of food is not a challenge in South Africa, at least for the next 11 months. That's where I would say we will be fine. Thereafter, it will depend a lot about what happens around about October this year.
Yeah, and I think what we learned from 2008 is that the knock-on effects of a food security crisis can be completely revolutionary in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, that's 100%. And there are countries, Richard, that I worry a lot about, because while South Africa is sitting in a relatively good angle, if you look north of our borders, you look at Zimbabwe, you look at Mozambique, you can even go far up as the East Africa. You think of Kenya, you think of Malawi, in all of those areas, because while South Africa was getting good rains and we were able to slowly get back into food production, those guys were hardest hit by the locusts. And now they are starting to replant in some other areas in Kenya. There are floods. So for the African continent, I think that food insecurity is going to be a bigger challenge. But here in the bottom tip of the south, we will be fine. And obviously the neighboring countries, your Swaziland, Lesotho, Botswana, I think those will be in good shape. But the continent at large, I mean, we have a bigger challenge here of food. And the World Bank, in their latest Africa Pulse report, they actually put some numbers on that. And they worried more about the macroeconomic challenges, the buying power of people that is actually declining, and also now the fact that they just can't grow what they need to do.
Well, this is exactly right. And I think what we need to start to do is, and we're terrible at this in South Africa. You're one of the few people, I think, who understands that the world doesn't actually stop at the Limpopo. I think whatever conception we've had about a migrant crisis in this country is about to be reconceptualized for us, because the real challenges of hunger coming down from us from the north, I think, are going to change the complexion of how the movement of populations in Southern Africa functions. It's not just going to be economic migrants, it's going to be people fleeing famine, real starvation in the near future.
Yeah, I mean, and I think South Africa even has a bigger role now, Richard, to just quickly jump on that, because that we are chairing the AU. So a number of these problems that happens in a continent, we can't just see them as problems there, but I think we have to think about what role can we play as a country to assist in stabilizing those countries, while obviously having to deal with some of our challenges that we are having in many of the communities in South Africa.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I know you have the President Ramaphosa on speed dial. So you may want to remind him that crafting a pretty good Southern African policy right now would be welcome. Okay, but anyways, let's jump into the meat of it, because land in this country. I mean, where do you even start? A nice place to start is to figure out or to come to terms with who owns what. And the truth of it is, in this country, we're not entirely sure, are we? We don't have a land registry
Yeah.
that properly details who owns what. So where do we begin crafting policy if we're kind of in the dark off the bat?
Yeah, I mean, that's the major challenge on the land statistics in South Africa, because every number depends on who you're speaking to. If you were to talk to myself and some of our colleagues, for example, Professor Johan Kirstein at Stellenbosch University, we would give you certain numbers. But then if you talk to Agri-SA, which they've done their own numbers, they'll give you the numbers. You talk to the South African authorities and the government, they'll give you their numbers. So that is a place, and even in a report that we had written up, that advisory panel report to the president, we had said that we need to begin to think about how do we do a proper land audit. Because right now we are shooting in the dark. We don't really know how much progress we are making. And I think that's an important area to also pursue. But obviously we can't stop everything else and say, can we stop everything else and first do the audit? There is some land that I think that can pretty much be passed on to people while the audit is carrying on the side.
When you say there is land that can be passed on to people, what land are you speaking about?
I mean, starting from 1994 and going up until now, the South African government has been buying land in the market. And obviously, up until 2006 or so, that land was transferred with title deeds to people. But since we instituted what is called the proactive land acquisition strategy, a lot of land that the state bought since then was never really transferred with title deeds to folks. The numbers now that we have suggest that roughly close to 9 million hectares of land that might be on a government books. Then post-COVID-19, one of the key things that we need to think about, we need to say, what do we do with the resources that we have? Because this is a society that we'll be facing when we come out of this pandemic. It's going to be a society where inequality is somewhat really increased. A lot of people will be out of their jobs. Many of us are predicting over 1 million people will be out of their jobs already with the disruption that is happening. If the pandemic is prolonged for longer, the number might get bigger, and the economic conditions will be poor broadly in South Africa. Therefore, the question would be to say, what do we do with the resources we have? We know agriculture can absorb some people for a certain period of time. Therefore, in there, how do we make agriculture to be pretty much more vibrant, expansion in activity? That expansion in activity and area planting will lean on this new land that is sitting with the state, and that will need to be transferred to people, and proper plans will need to be in place and really bringing it into full production. So those are some of the things that we'll need to be thinking about. That's the resource that I'm saying is what we have, and we need to use it efficiently.
So what fascinates me is the fact that we're potentially looking on the back of COVID-19 at a revolution in how we conceive of agriculture as a means to sort of usher us out of this crisis and into a more sustainable future, where it's not simply about us going to hyper-fragile economic institutions like ShopRite or Checkers to get our food, but perhaps to start living off the land a little bit more sustainably. When you guys are gaming out, and you and your colleagues are gaming out how things might look post-COVID-19, what are you thinking about?
I mean, one of the things that we're thinking about a lot at this point is really drawing. Firstly, in South Africa, there hasn't been major disruption in the South African agricultural sector and food sector because of COVID-19. But if you look in you think of the United States, for example, the guys have been struggling to get labor in for harvesting, particularly the migrants that are coming from Mexico. And the second point is that we've seen the spread of the virus in large number of plants in the US. And they meant that now people had to be out of work. And there's now all of these talks about beef shortage in some certain state. And you look also across the Atlantic, you look at Europe, a number of countries, Netherlands, Germany, Italy, France, have been struggling to get labor in those farms because, again, of the closure of the borders of some of the labor that is coming from Eastern Europe. Now, what this has pretty much caused, if you listen to all of the CEOs of the major agribusinesses, is this hunger for automation to say, after this crisis, with the money that we have, we need to invest more on technology, replacing people so that we don't get to these inconveniences. If then that happens in the developed world, you only have a certain few years before you see those technologies diffusing into South Africa. Therefore, South African agricultural sector being at a place where now we're no longer going to be looking for those jobs that we've been talking about a lot before COVID-19, but there's going to be a structural shift on the labor market. And this is leading us to a belief that we say, look, within the next decade or 15 years, we need to make sure that we do what we can on expanding agriculture, creating jobs. Because post that, yes, we might expand agriculture and gain value, but in as far as employment, the employment opportunities might not be as solid as what we had before COVID-19. So it's really those structural thing of saying this disruption in the developed world, what do they mean for the developing countries like ours? And how much time do we have to really get people working in agriculture? And if you're South Africa, you need to be paying really much attention in there because we are interlinked to the global agricultural sector. So anything that happens, it really lands on our table.
Now, when you pose this scenario for us, you're doing so within the context of Section 25 of the Constitution being untrammeled or unchanged, and largely the system around us not changing radically either. But as you know, you're more aware than pretty much anyone in the country. The system itself, for better or for worse, is under threat. I have a question here from Christopher Rawbone Fillion. On the presidential panel, did Wandile support the policy of land expropriation without compensation? If so, knowing the catastrophic impact this will have on investment, why do you support expropriation without compensation, Wandile? Just spoiler alert, Wandile does not support EWC.
100%. And the book does explain how decision-making in that actually turned up about. If he wants to get on how the discussion actually unfolded in the room, you get the book and then you will see on how, but expropriation without compensation is not a desired thing for agriculture. So yeah.
It may not be a desired thing for agriculture, but as a raw and emotive piece of political energizing matter, EWC has been one of the most important talking points post-democracy. So I want you to put on your red overall, and I want you to tell us, were EWC to happen as a piece of policy, how would something like this work? How would the government go about taking the land, nationalizing the land?
I think the challenge that we need to think about on this now, Richard, and again, Chris's point is important, not so much the personal aspect of it, but it generally, broadly, the question. Because you are coming out of COVID-19, you need to get growth in the economy, you need to get jobs. Some of the things then that you will be thinking about is to say, how do you do this efficiently and at a much faster pace? And in all of this, looking at the structure of South African agricultural sector, it is highly capital intensive. So for any expansion or any growth that you will be needing to, you will realize in agriculture, you need to get money onto the investment of that. So the minute you start now thinking about expropriation without compensation and a wide-scale nationalization of South Africa, and I think that is not going to be helpful for growth post-COVID-19, which is why I was saying when we come out of this, we need to first look at saying how much land actually have on its books, and then we see how do we allocate that land to people that will use it productively at a much faster pace. Thereafter, you look and say, okay, we've allocated this land. We see 1, 2, 3 is being done in this community. How do we then embark and continue with the land reform in a sustainable way that will continue to get investments in the sector? Because that's what we need. Land reform on its own has to happen, but the issue is about which instruments do you need? And the instruments of EWC is not the desired one.
Okay, that being said, we're seeing all over the world an expansion of the state into crannies of everyday life that we couldn't have anticipated even 6 weeks ago. Why isn't more state involvement in land ownership in this country? Why isn't more state involvement in support for agriculture in this country something that's desirable? That's exactly what happened during apartheid. What is the difference now? Why all of a sudden is expropriation without compensation effectively the hallmark of colonial land distribution? Why isn't it good enough for us right now?
I think part of the reason is the fact that the world has changed somewhat from back in 1912 when all of this happened. In a sense that now we are much more in a globalized system. And back to the point that I was making, that South Africa's agricultural sector and just broadly in a number of industries are capital intensive. So anything that will chase away capital, it doesn't end up in a situation that actually gives you progress. Because now you can go and expropriate, firstly, even like today, you change the constitution, you say you expropriate. Firstly, do you have the capacity to even be able to reallocate what you have expropriated to people? Because the first things that needs to happen, we also still need to build the capacity of the state. But second, the point of why we're not doing it now is the fact that the economic systems are pretty much different than what we used to. So you can't be going down those routes. But for me, if I were you, I'd say what needs to be done is that reallocation of the land. And the second point is really strengthening the capacity of the state. But post-COVID-19, you're not going to be able to quickly do all of that, which is where private sector is also needed on the table to actually grow in South Africa. And we've already seen that. I mean, if you think about now, there's a lot of this private sector, public sector engagements that is happening. If we leverage on this good energy of this COVID-19 as we rebuild out of this, because there is some trust that is also developing between these two parties now. So those are some of the things that we really need to get land reform and get growth going in South Africa.
One of the surprising things about your book is how is when you actually dig into empowerment, agricultural empowerment schemes during apartheid. What you and some of your colleagues saying is that there were some really good ideas there. Not in terms of dispossession, but in terms of how to empower a new entire field of, so to speak, of agricultural developers. The allotment of land in terms of Section 25 of the Land Settlement Act of 1956, you speak about as being a good model, a mixture of rental, rent to purchase, and support from the government. And this is what you seem to hammer on so often, is that support from the government for new entrants into the agricultural market is absolutely essential. So now you're adding in, I mean, I think we've seen with the Solidarity Fund, and I think we may all be a little bit drunk on the fact that the private sector has jumped in this crisis to help us out. The private sector acts in self-interest and often self-interest alone. But one of the things you say so often is that this melding between real support from the private sector, but also real state support, is the key thing that's being missing in generating an entirely new generation of farmers. So can you speak about it? What would real state support look like?
Yeah, I mean, we are beginning to see some of this, Richard, because yes, we can have ideas on a solidarity fund, but I think even before that, I mean, there's a number of areas. If you think of the town called Humansdorp in the Eastern Cape, there's some work that is done there by the guys called the Co-op. They are working with the government. What the government is doing there is actually availing land and then going to these private sector participants that are there saying, okay, how can you work with these guys, these new farmers that are here, firstly on training, and second on making sure that they have the market for what they produce, and we will be capitalizing their production loans by 50%, and we need you to also come in play onto this. And people are increasingly open for this, because the other thing that we have to realize is that the private sector, and as well as the farmers in South Africa as well, they are getting anxious about some of the policies that are being proposed. They see inequality that is happening. They see potential instability that is there. So that on its own offers them then that I would say is an incentive or fear or discomfort of saying we better come to the table to make sure that everyone participates. Otherwise, if we say, okay, sit there, we will continue to farming on its own, then that is not a sustainable model. And I think that people are actually getting that into their heads. So the really two primary things that private sector brings into the table. It's the know-how, and it's also some of the capital that is needed, because government doesn't really have much resources on its pocket right now.
And presumably it will have less every day this crisis goes on.
Right.
I have a question from Tebogo Bosiu. The Minerals Act of 2003 effectively nationalized all minerals in South Africa below the ground, and we didn't see capital flight from those sectors. Why would it happen with agriculture?
Yeah, but I mean, it's a different way than the agricultural side, because on the agriculture now you will be nationalizing, and then what terms would you be having with the farmers that are in there, because they are lending and investing in all of the infrastructure that they are having on agriculture, backing that with it. So it's a different situation than comparing on what was happening on a mineral side. So for me, and I mean, over and over again, which is the issue for me with South Africa, we keep having this discussion, but we do have empirical evidence where some of these things have actually happened, and the outcome has not been really good. So.
Okay. I suppose tied to this is, of course, the land bank, another one of our great state-run institutions that seems to have run in a little trouble in recent times. Can you speak to us a little bit about what the land bank is supposed to do, how it's supposed to be run, the situation that it's in right now, and where you see it going in the future?
Yeah, I'm not going to comment, Richard, specifically on the land bank because of our close involvement and actors. But all I can say is that the land bank mandate, I mean, it's for both to participate in helping on land reform, helping in development, helping in strengthening of the food security. And it's clearly stated there they are governed by the Act of 2002, published on the 10th of June 2002, which is what gives them the mandate. But obviously, if you were to look at how they've been operating, I mean, roughly about 80% or so of their book is on the commercial side. It's only about 20% that is doing the development work. And that goes back to how the land bank has been capitalized. But I won't get into the details of how they are dealing, because we are closer to the heat there. So I'd rather not comment. All I can say is that the agricultural sector will need more capital. So if there's any possible way for the bank to be supported, that is what is essential. It needs to be supported to come back and be able to participate in the sector and assist on its broader mandate. And obviously, there's a lot of work that needs to be thought about the bank going forward on how it should be capitalized and all other things.
So you wouldn't agree with the statement that the land bank is basically SAA except with cows?
Yeah, I won't comment on that.
Okay. One of the things I think is so interesting that you point out, one of the things that sort of generated your interest when you first started looking at the agricultural sector is the observation that commercial agriculture in this country remains white. Smallholder agriculture in this country remains black. As the COVID-19 crisis progresses, and as the entire financial system gets upended, do you not see us moving towards a more blended model where small holdings become much more important in a sort of re-upped, redevised agricultural sector? This focus on monoculture perhaps disappearing, this focus on big agri disappearing. Is there a silver lining that COVID-19 can sort of meld smallholders and commercial farms in a way that really helps transform the sector meaningfully?
Yeah, no, I think, Richard, we would have to be quite not to. I wouldn't favor a situation, and I mean I've written about that, where we say we need to make sure that now we focus on creating smallholder farmers and all of those things. The basic first part, it's what you are narrating now, whereby whenever we think about smallholder farmers, we think about some black guys doing some stuff. When you think about commercial farmers, you think about white guys doing that. That's the one part of it. But second part of the story goes back to saying, how do you sustain the food system of the country? Smallholder farmers can never be able to sustain the food system that South Africa is actually having, because we are a country that is about what? We are the 32nd biggest exporter of agricultural produce. On exports, you're generating north of $10 billion a year. So the productivity levels and the investments that has already been made in the sector might not be able to be yielded if you were to go on a smallholder route. And I think that we would suffer the national food security that for so many years we've been able to build. But the first point then, to go back to the one of saying you have this smallholder farmers that are black guys and the commercial, that needs to change. Which again goes back to the point where I was saying, how do you progressively make sure that many people, they participate in the sector? How do you commercialize as many as you can some of the other emerging or developing farmers at this point? Obviously, at a sustainable pace. You can't wake up today and suddenly you're giving a guy one of the biggest farms in South Africa, you say get in there and run it. There needs to be systems on how people progress as they get into these activities. But I think overall, the South African agriculture sector will accommodate everyone. There are areas for smallholder farmers, there are areas for commercial farmers, but I don't think that we should really be focused onto that. Otherwise, we would run in some landmines if we wanna decide where people should fit in farming.
Okay, so I mean, effectively, the way you see transformation is moving black farmers into commercial sector. You don't see a more blended model. Am I correct in hearing that?
I need more black farmers getting into the commercial space, but at the same time, in areas where you can only have small-scale farmers, you let them thrive in those areas. You're not in a situation where you are literally abolishing all of them and saying everyone commercialize. Accommodate everyone.
I've got an interesting question here from Elton Griev. Wandile, what happened to AgBiz's Banking Association's mixed funding model with government in support of land reform? How have commercial banks supported land reform? Because this goes back to your statement about, you know, big business actually stepping up to the plate and transforming in this country. How have commercial banks stood up and said, okay, let's see what we can do to support this new emerging sector?
Yeah, no, the commercial banks, Richard, didn't fold their arms and not want to participate on land reform. What Elton is referring to now is a good point, because at AgBiz on our side, with the Banking Association of South Africa, we came up with what we call the AgBiz-BASA land reform model, which was actually saying, let's go to R1 by R1 and buy land for land reform. Then the other R1 of the private sector will obviously be a loan at a preferential rate, while the government one will get to be a fund. And then the land will be transferred with the title deeds to the beneficiary. And then the state didn't come into the table fully on that model. Those are some of the things that we are hoping with the new leadership at government right now, with the farming conditions having changed, with the economic conditions that are already bleak in the country. Maybe people will wake up and be warm to those ideas, and then we can put them on the table and proceed. And I think the other important part is that now the government is working on these agriculture master plans, which facilitates both private sector and the public sector engagements. And these are some of the ideas that we are putting on the table into those. So to Elton, the model is still there, but it was just not fully accepted at the time. So we'll continue to lobby for it.
Okay. I want to shift something to transformation of a different nature. One of the things that can get a little frustrating about the land reform debate is that it's so politicized and it doesn't seem to marry climate change and agriculture in a meaningful way. In other words, it sort of ignores indigenous voices. It ignores indigenous farming practices I suppose, in support of a much larger commercial agricultural product that we produce so well here in this country. There's a great question from Beulah Tambadu over here. Wandile, should we reduce our meat farming in favor of vegetable farming for obvious reasons which might not be obvious to everyone? So I guess me and Beulah are asking the same thing. Should we not change not only what we farm, but how we farm in order to farm more sustainably and in order to start marrying this idea of land reform with saving the damn planet?
Yeah, I think there, Richard, on South Africa's agriculture, we don't have much area that is actually arable doing vegetables all over. In a number of provinces, we really have to do livestock. So those are the other conditions that actually forces us to fall in that way. So I wouldn't actually get to a situation where I say reduce your livestock and get more on crop farming, on field crops, because agroecological conditions in South Africa just don't allow that. You have over 70% of the area which is not really arable for anything than actually the livestock sector. So we're not really intense in that. But some countries, the situation you are mentioning might be true, but for South Africa, it's not really true in that nature. But the bigger point also that you both are raising, the story of the climate change is one that is important. And we've seen how much instability it has caused in the sector throughout, particularly over the past 5 years. So thinking about climate change and thinking about what are the farming, how do we improve our farming practices while still maintaining even some of the crops and the areas of focus that we are having, which is field crops, livestock, as well as horticulture, is one of the important things that we need to be thinking about. Let's farm better. Let's know that the climate change is a real threat. And even in our report of the Land Reform Panel, there is a section there which we dedicated a lot dealing with the issue of the climate change, which people like Bulelwa Mapasa, Ruth Hall, and the other colleagues, and Vuyo Mahlati felt strongly about the climate change issue, rightly so. And I think it's an important thing to focus on.
Okay, so let's, I do want to speak a little more about it, because once again, if we go back to the food security crises of 2000, 2009, leading up to what it was effectively an agricultural, a water security crisis in Syria, which in turn led to all of the discord in Syria, which is still going on today, a massive geopolitical flap, which many commentators term the first climate change war, effectively. If we think we have a problem now in terms of the discord over land reform, surely when arable land shrinks even further, when the climate gets even hotter, when we return to burning all of our fossil fuels after this crisis is over, and the COVID crisis has a timeline, the climate change crisis doesn't. What do we need to do to keep this in check, to ensure that the entire agricultural sector starts to speak about this in terms that every South African can understand?
I think for the agricultural sector, they actually now, I mean, if you were to think back in the 2000s, maybe there might be a reluctance to move to the better farming practices, do conservation agriculture and all of these other things. But the droughts are actually, and the floods are hitting their pocket. Because if I plant now in October, then somewhere in January, I hit on a drought and then it kills everything in the farm. It actually hits the farmer's pocket. So they're the ones that are actually now increasingly wanting to adapt more to better farming practices because it eats their bottom line. And the other thing, though, that we might have to be thinking about is to say, what's the role of technology in assisting us in this space? And we've seen the positive role of technology in South Africa. Think last year, for example, opening introduction, you talked about the drought that led many African countries, Zimbabwe and everybody else, being being in a situation that they were food insecure. But in South Africa, we still were able to export. One of the stories there was how much we're able to get better yields, have shorter growing varieties of seeds, whereby instead of waiting for 6 months, you can do something in really a short period of time, 4 or 5 months or so. Those are some of the things to say, seed breeders, are you considering technology as you're breeding the seeds? What role are you going to bring in the table? Farmers, are you moving to conservation agriculture and doing all other practices that limit all of the other thing? And I think that conversation is beginning, at least now, to start, particularly on the farming side. And again, to the point that I made earlier, what pushes them to do that is because if they don't do it, it eats on their profitability. So they have no other way but to comply and farm better.
Is change possible when big agriculture, big agri, Monsanto, all of these really, really bad corporations, is change even possible when they hold so many of the cards in the market? Can we change? Are they not actually the problem?
No, change is possible because all of these agribusinesses and the people you're talking about, they play an important role on stabilizing the food system that we have. It's easier when we're sitting down to talk to you about some of these guys, but if you take them out of the equation and some of the better technologies they have brought over the years, you wouldn't be able to enjoy the stable food production that we have. You're in a situation now where you can buy apples throughout the year. You can buy your affordable maize. You can buy tomatoes out throughout the year. 50 years back, maybe that was not the case in South Africa. 100 years back, that was not the case in many countries. So these agribusinesses and all of these key players that are bringing these technologies are actually making the food sector better. But obviously the regulators need to be there to pinpoint in some of the areas where they feel that they are not good for society, they are not good for environment. Regulators need to be watching onto that. But I wouldn't get to a space where I was saying these players are making the environment unstable. I'll say regulators watch, but allow for creativity and progress to happen. And change is possible, and climate change is going to force it.
We do have an example very close to our borders of what radical land reform looks like. In terms of the agricultural sector in Zimbabwe, where are things right now? Have the smaller A-grade farms started to bounce back? Has radical land reform in Zimbabwe done anything good for the agricultural sector in that country?
I mean, on this question, it depends again, Richard, on who you talk to. Because some people celebrate the fact that now there's more Black people owning small farms and being able to produce tobacco and some of the other things. But if you look at it at a broader scheme of things, to say the value that agriculture brings into Zimbabwe, there hasn't been progress there. It's been a dismal failure. You look at the basic commodities like maize. This year, they're only expecting to produce about 880,000 tons. They need about 2 million tons for food. It was the same story last year and the years before that. I mean, if anyone celebrates Zimbabwe's success, they are not being sympathetic to the hardships that people face in there. So that, in my perspective, judging it on an economic perspective, but also social perspective, looking at it, it leaves nothing to be desired.
And perhaps part of the problem is that we don't think innovatively enough about what growing food can mean in peri-urban and urban areas in Southern Africa. I have a question here from Colleen Dardigan. What about the massive urbanization in South Africa from rural areas? So we know that part of the 20th and 21st century, the story of humanity is moving from rural areas into these bigger and bigger and bigger megacities. What do you guys do to study and encourage urban farming practices?
Yeah, I think this, Richard, it also, I would answer it in two ways. Firstly, that massive urbanization which is happening and will continue to happen in many countries, it again means that you need to be having a commercial, large-scale agriculture in the country to be able to produce some of the massive foods that will be needed in the urban areas. But for those that are in the urban areas, vertical farming schemes are starting to pop up in a number of areas. People are beginning to farm in that. And we have been, for example, last year in conversation with some of the mining houses that are actually giving land that is closer to the urban areas and wanting it to be moved on to food production. So there is something that can be done there on urban farming. But on urban farming, you can never be able to produce, at least for now, you don't have the capability to actually produce all of the calories that are needed to be consumed throughout the city. So you still pretty much rely heavily on what is coming up at the heartland. But within the urban areas, you really produce some of the things that will be needed by some of the restaurants that are close by, either through vegetable side and all of those things. And I would encourage that. It actually makes living conditions better. If you think of it now, if you can go to any of these townships in South Africa post-COVID-19, have other people settled to other areas and leave more spacing and start doing gardenings and all of those things, it will make living conditions better. And people actually be happier in living in all of those areas. And I think that for the guys that are on Minister Sisulu's department, when they think about all of the housing developments in the future, they need to actually be thinking about the gardenings that people could do so that their spaces are livable. But for food security, you really need those guys that are on the heartland to continue producing the stuff that we need in the urban areas.
Yeah, I think if it's happening in developed countries where cities are starting to conceive of new neighborhoods and new developments as having a urban farming component, beekeeping, I'm thinking of, basic vegetable growing, perhaps we need to be thinking about this stuff very seriously here in South Africa as well. And just quickly, I want to touch on sort of the flip side of urbanization, and that is the very real connection that many South Africans have with communal land, with the land where they come from, where their ancestors are buried. Tell us a little bit about how things are happening on communal land in this country, land run by traditional leaders. What is being done over there to encourage meaningful farming, meaningful agriculture, and land tenureship that actually counts?
Yeah, I mean, you can't paint that one on a one paintbrush, because it depends on the area by area. There are some areas. I mean, if you think of Kiskamawuk in the Eastern Cape, area called Qobo, there's land that is actually on a communal land, and they've allowed agribusinesses, and they partnered with the people in those areas, and there's beginning to be some development that is happening there. But again, that development of agriculture is depending on the money that is coming from government, and the other half of it that came from the private sector side. But if you want to do meaningful changes or empower people, you can apply the issue of title deeds to a certain extent in communal areas. But I would want people to imagine, because I'm from those areas, and you have to imagine our communities in three ways. There's what we call emakaya, which is your human settlement, where you have your house and everything. And then there's amadlelo, which is where cattle grazing and everything. And then there's amasimi, which is where you grow your crops and everything. So you can think about the titling of the land in the areas where you have agricultural practices. But where people reside in their houses, I would say be slow on thinking onto that. As much as I'm an economist and understanding all of these things, but you need also to consider the culture and the complexities of land reform. And there's an essay in the book which we deal with this with a guy called Theo Boshoff and Professor Mzuki Sihlobo, where we deal about the complexities of South African communal land. And I think that we need to think about that in those ways. So title deeds, consider empowering that in the fields and all on the grazing land. But for communal, for houses, think deeply before you do anything onto that extent.
No, look, I've saved the best for last. Tell us about cannabis growing in this country. Talk to us about the possibilities, and speak to us about why the government absolutely, I mean, we're now in a re-upped era of prohibition. Whether or not you think the prohibition on booze and cigarettes is good or bad, we all know that what happens in a prohibition economy, and that is that the underworld effectively takes over. Government loses out on the taxes, and effectively it never really ends well. Just go watch The Untouchables or any gangster movie on Netflix if you don't believe me. But we've been in an unbroken era of cannabis prohibition in this country, insanely. How do we fix this? What is actually happening to fix this? How are policy changes here being driven? And how much money can this actually mean for South Africans who are looking down at probably the greatest economic crisis in our history?
Yeah, I mean, the story of cannabis, again, I think that the sentiment in South Africa is somewhat changing right now. You say it's been prohibited for almost since the early 30s or so, but right now, because of what people are seeing happening in the US, in Canada, and all other countries, South Africa is increasingly moving to a state where they say, okay, we need to be thinking about liberalizing the crop and have it planted. But I think in South Africa, the challenge is we're talking a lot about what could potentially happen. But there's not enough work that is being done on regulations of saying, okay, as we liberalize the crop, what will be the production conditions? How it will be regulated? How do we make sure that the value chain is being created? And I think that's where the energies should be. I know my colleagues at the Department of Agriculture, they have a work stream now in their master plan, which is focused on cannabis, which is actually see that it is being taken seriously. The finance minister tweets now over and again about the possibilities of it. If you look at the value of the crop globally, I mean, it's expected by Barclays that by 2025, it will be north of $425 billion US. So that's the big industry. And we've seen jobs in the value chain of it in Canada. There won't be a lot of jobs in the production of it. Again, from anecdotal evidence, I come from what is called Dagga Belt of the Eastern Cape. So I'm pretty much with how things would potentially happen. I'm not saying I've seen things. I'm not snitching on anything.
Sure you're not. Yeah.
But on a serious stance, I do think that there is value that can be created and a lot of jobs that can be there. But let's think about legislatively, how do we liberalize that crop? How do we develop the value chain so that South Africa could catch up onto that? The most important thing to close off on this point, on the licensing issue, we need to be thinking deeply about that, Richard. We've seen in Zimbabwe, for example, how the license could be R500,000. In Lesotho, it's the same story. If you keep it at South Africa, a licensing at 300,000 Rand or so, you are again going to a point where you are excluding all poor people from participating on this crop and enforcing the same issue that those that are already privileged should be the ones that are participating in here. So we need to think strategically about how we do that and not to be create these policies that exclude other people. And also obviously then develop the value chains. And that development of the value chain, you can think about 3 provinces at which I think you should prioritize, because I think Eastern Cape, KZN, and Limpopo should be priority for agricultural development. There's a high levels of poverty there, but also those are the provinces that have possibilities of agriculture and agro-processing development.
Okay. So look, to close off, and loads of people are asking this question. I'm asking it myself. Is there an appetite for land reform? Is there an appetite for innovation? And is there an appetite for change within the governing ANC at this moment?
I think there is appetite from those that I am in speaking terms with. There seems to be an appetite for land reform. There's an appetite for innovation. There's an appetite for growth. In fact, agriculture has been centered as one of the sectors that will carry us through amongst many sectors when we're rebuilding post-COVID-19 going forward. But obviously, again, to the same points that we've discussed at the beginning, all of these things will need investments. It will need stability. So as much as we will be emphasizing inclusion, but we need not to come up with some of the policies that will actually destabilize or make us not be able to get the monies that we need to be developing the sector. Prioritize inclusion, but not radical policies that are really destabilizing. So I think we need to be thinking about those a lot. And fortunately, we are amongst some of those people that are thinking about these things going forward. And those are ideas that we'll emphasize in the planning processes.
So in summary, no one can accuse you of being for expropriation without compensation. You haven't seen where wheat grows, and you don't know anyone who grows it, but you feel it's a good idea.
I don't know.
And commercial farming needs to grow. It needs backing from the banks. It needs backing from the big institutions. And of course, it needs backing from the government. That's what will lead to food security. Many people will disagree with you, and many people do. But what they need to do, if they're going to disagree, is read your book, Finding Common Ground, Land, Equity, and Agriculture. Can we see that beautiful green cover one more time, please?
There you go.
Everybody, please go out and not grow it, buy it. Who knows? Maybe there will be innovations in the future where we can grow books. I mean, now you get your books from Uber Eats, so it's a natural movement. So guys, thank you very much for being with us. This hour just absolutely flew by. I wish we could keep going. Wandile, thank you very much for being with us. Again, I want to thank the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung organization for supporting this webinar. And of course, to my homies at Daily Maverick, I love you all. Thank you very much. And yeah, all go well. And remember the regulations and be home before 8 p.m. tonight, please. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Wandile.
Thank you.